Hey there! Let's continue our journey into how a computer works. In the previous video, we talked about how CPU, RAM, and motherboard makes a real but useless computer. To make a computer useful, it is necessary to add more components. Computer components are plugged into the motherboard via so-called ports. Most famous example of a port is the USB port, which you must have used many times, but you also should know that there are other types of ports to add components and devices to the computer. Today we will talk about a family of components called storage. Most important member of this family is HDD, which stands for hard disk drive. You may have heard people referencing to it as hard drive or even simply disk. You may have also heard about more expensive and performant version of the hard drive called SSD, solid state drive, but the idea around it is the same. Hard drive is usually installed inside the computer and is not visible outside. There are also other kinds of storage, for example, USB flash drive. Also, there are devices which allow to plug and unplug storage volumes. For example, memory card reader, CD-ROM drive, and even floppy disk drive, which is long dead but still famous because software keep using its pictures as a save document icon. Storage is used to keep data in programs, and some people may confuse it with RAM and mistakenly reference to it as the memory. It is important to understand the difference. The key difference between RAM and storage is that CPU cannot work with the data in the storage directly. If CPU needs to execute commands or process the data from the storage, it needs to load the commands and the data from the storage to the memory. Another thing about storage is that the data which is stored there is not wiped out when the computer is powered off or restarted, in contrast to the memory, which is not capable of preserving the data in case of power supply interruption, for example when the computer is restarted or powered off. And another important thing to note is that the memory capacity is limited by how much memory the CPU can interact with, versus how the storage capacity can be practically unlimited. Also, the hard drive usually has much bigger capacity than the memory, as it needs to keep all the data the computer may need. To continue the analogy with the office worker from the previous video, we can think of the storage as the bookshelves in the office. If the worker is diligent as the computer is, they keep all their documents and books on the shelves while not in use, as computer keeps all the data on the hard drive or another storage, and they keep their desk clean as computer keeps the memory clean. Then, when they need something, they take it from the shelves, put it into the desk, and work with it, like CPU would need to take the data from the storage and put it into the memory. As soon as the work is completed, they put things back to the shelves. If they forget to put their stuff away and leave it on the desk, the cleaning person will throw everything away, assuming that what's left is just the garbage, but they will not touch the shelves. Like if computer is powered off or restarted, the memory but not the storage is wiped. Now let's see how the storage helps solving some of the problems we saw with the bare CPU RAM computer. You might have heard of a so-called operating system, or simply OS. Most popular operating systems are Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. Operating system is just a special kind of a program which you usually use when working with the computer, even without thinking much about it. One of the main functions of any operating system is providing an interface which lets user access files and run programs stored in the computer storage. So as soon as you have an operating system loaded into the memory and CPU is executing its commands, you can use it to create and start any program you wish. Now the question is how that operating system gets loaded into the memory. You may remember from the previous video how when the computer starts, motherboard loads the BIOS firmware into the memory, and CPU starts executing it. We talked about how we could mess with the firmware to load and run our program, but we also mentioned that it was not a good idea. Firmware does many important things, and one of them is it looks for a storage and for another special program in the storage called Bootloader. Once found, firmware will load the bootloader into the memory and will let CPU to jump executing commands from the bootloader. The bootloader in its turn will know where to look for the operating system, will load it into the memory, and as soon as it is ready, will let CPU to jump executing commands from the operating system. So again, when computer starts, the following steps take place. Motherboard loads BIOS firmware into the memory, and CPU starts executing its commands. The firmware looks for a bootloader in the storage and loads it into the memory, then instructs CPU to start executing bootloader commands. The bootloader loads operating system into the memory and instructs CPU to start executing operating system's commands. The operating system will load all it needs and the computer becomes ready to interact with the user and execute any command the user wants. Now, as we have the computer which is ready to receive commands from the user, we need more components added to let the user interact with the computer. We will talk about that in the next video, and for now, thanks for watching, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I hope to see you again soon.